Hi, I'm Kenny Levine. I'm a therapist and coach who helps people overcome conflict and miscommunication to reclaim their lives and build their best relationships. I know that finding the right therapist for you can be daunting, but I'm here to give you some tips for finding the perfect fit therapist for you. When you're looking for a therapist, the first thing you should ask yourself is, what are you wanting to get out of therapy? What are the issues you're hoping therapy can help you with? For some people, that's an easy question. Maybe their relationship is in crisis or they're struggling with worry and anxiety, but other people just have a vague sense that something isn't right. They're struggling with emotions they don't quite understand, and they might be having a hard time pinpointing exactly what they want to work on in therapy. If you have a sense that you want therapy, but you're not quite sure how to tell a new therapist what you need, here's my first tip. A question you might ask yourself is, if I were to imagine seeing a therapist for a while, and when we wrapped up therapy, I was thinking, wow, that was super helpful. I am so glad I went to therapy. If you were saying that, what would be different about you or your life? Asking yourself that question can help you figure out what you want to work on in therapy. Once you know that, you can get to work on finding a therapist who works with those issues. Now, you should also think about whether you want to meet with a therapist in person or if you'd like to meet online via telehealth. A lot of people ask me if one is better than the other, and as with most things in therapy, the answer is it depends. Studies have shown that therapy by telehealth is effective, but it hasn't really been around long enough for us to have a lot of definitive data. But one thing we do know that can be important for therapy by telehealth to be effective is if the client is choosing telehealth as their preferred delivery method. So think about your schedule, your location, your desire to spend time physically interacting with someone versus your desire for convenience. And when it comes to in-person or online, go with whatever your gut says. Once you understand your own therapy needs, the next step is for you to get some names of therapists who work with those issues and have availability. Now, I know that a lot of people these days are turning to companies like BetterHelp. I have my thoughts about BetterHelp, but I'm just going to save those for a future video. But let's just say, for the sake of argument, that you're going to pick a therapist who's either in solo private practice, part of a group practice, or maybe is even part of a large hospital system or medical facility near you. The next question you need to ask yourself is, do you need to use your health insurance benefits to pay for your counseling, or are you able to pay out of pocket? Insurance benefits for therapy vary from one health insurance plan to another. So if you plan to use your health insurance, you need to call the customer service number on your card or look online at your insurance company's website and find a therapist that works with your insurance company. Now, while there are certainly some therapists in private practice who take health insurance, something you need to know is that taking insurance requires a lot of administrative work that many therapists in private practice don't have time to do themselves and don't have a staff to do for them. Also, when you accept health insurance as a therapist, you have to agree to accept a lower reimbursement rate just for the privilege of being part of their network. So the upshot is that many therapists who can keep a busy private practice filled without taking insurance will make the choice to only accept self-pay clients. So the upshot is, if you want to use health insurance, your best bet might be to Google group therapy practice near me or call your local hospital system, because chances are at one of those places there's a therapist with openings who takes your insurance. But the downside, of course, is that you may have to work with whichever therapist the group practice or hospital system assigns you, rather than being able to select the therapist that you most want to see. On the other hand, if you're able to afford therapy out of pocket, you're likely to have a much wider selection of therapists in private practice to choose from. How can you go about finding them? There are lots of people you can ask to recommend a therapist who can likely give you some names of good therapists. Ask yourself, who you know, whose judgment you trust, and who is plugged into the resources in your community. This could be your doctor, a professor, your clergy person, or even a friend, though I recommend being very cautious about seeing the same therapist as anyone you're super close to. If you have a best friend, sibling, or spouse who sees a therapist they like, you can call that therapist and ask if they can recommend another therapist in the community, rather than seeing that same therapist yourself. Some therapists will do that, but in my opinion, it's a bad idea. It sends the wrong message about boundaries, and I don't do it. Finally, there are a lot of online directories you can use to find a therapist. By far, the biggest one is Psychology Today. A huge proportion of therapists in the country have a profile on there. That directory can be great because there are so many therapists to choose from, but it can also be a little overwhelming and hard to narrow down, though you can filter by your insurance plan if you need to. Also, although Psychology Today says they verify therapists, all they're really doing is checking to see if that therapist has an active license that's in good standing to practice therapy in your state. Some other directories, such as Best Therapists, do much more vetting and keep a smaller, more curated list of therapists to choose from. Best Therapists requires clinicians to submit 3 letters of recommendation from other therapists, and they perform some due diligence background checks to see if there are any red flags in the therapist's background. There are a number of other directories as well, and I'll link to all of the most widely used therapist directories in the description below. Finally, it's important for you to know that most health insurance companies do not pay for couples counseling. The reason for this is that health insurance is set up to reimburse for treatment of one individual's medical condition, and the need for treatment has to meet a standard called medical necessity. Couples counseling isn't usually about treating one individual's mental health condition. Usually, couples counseling is about treating the relationship that's happening between the two partners, not one person's mental health diagnosis. And most health insurance, unfortunately, just isn't set up to pay for that. Now, let's take a few minutes to talk about how you find a therapist who is really compatible with you and exactly what that means and what it doesn't mean. I'm going to dive right into something that may spark a little discussion and maybe even some controversy, but I'm speaking from a place of decades of experience, and I think this is an important message to put out there. If you are, for example, LGBTQ or BIPOC or Jewish or neurodivergent, and you want to see a therapist who is also LGBTQ or BIPOC or Jewish or neurodivergent, that's great. Thankfully, we have more and more representation in the field of mental health. And if that's your priority in finding a therapist that's right for you, there are some online directories that are specifically designed to help you find a therapist who shares your identity. And I'll link to some of those in the description below. That said, just because you are LGBTQ or BIPOC or Jewish or neurodivergent, that doesn't mean that the only therapist that can be the right fit for you is one who is also LGBTQ or BIPOC or Jewish or neurodivergent. The reality is there can be potential upsides and potential downsides to seeing a therapist whose identity is very similar to yours and who predominantly sees only clients with a similar identity. First of all, just because someone is a therapist, that doesn't mean they've resolved all their own issues. I've seen plenty of situations where a client was struggling with some aspect of their identity, but because their therapist was also struggling with the same issue, the therapy got really stuck. Or maybe the therapist resolved that issue long ago and is getting a little unreasonably frustrated with their client because the client's still stuck in dealing with an issue that the therapist thinks they should be able to move past. Obviously, this isn't necessarily the case, but it can be the case. On the flip side, it can also sometimes be profoundly healing to get validation and support from someone very different from us, someone we might have never thought could really get our experience. So, to be clear, I'm not saying everyone should go out and try to find a therapist who's very unlike them. You might be able to establish a rapport more quickly with a therapist who shares your identity. And obviously, there can be lots of benefits to seeing a therapist who has tons of experience working with issues just like yours. But therapists are trained to be good listeners. And just like we shouldn't expect a South Asian physician to only see South Asian patients, I think we should all hold space for the idea that a good therapist is a good therapist. And certainly not all, but most good therapists can be highly effective working with clients who represent a wide range of identities. Any therapist who can't should be aware of their limitations and should refer that client to someone else. Now that we've got the question of identities out of the way, let's talk for a moment about different approaches to therapy. Most therapists were exposed to a wide range of treatment modalities early on in their education, but over time, as they progress in their careers, they pursue additional training in whatever kinds of therapies resonate with them most. There are hundreds of different approaches to therapy, and I definitely can't get into all of them now, but I do think it's important to understand the difference between evidence-based therapies and other approaches to therapy that are non-evidence-based. That last category could include traditional or historical approaches to therapy like psychoanalysis or alternative therapies or emerging therapies. But in recent years, there's really been a trend towards more and more use of evidence-based therapies. And those are certainly the approaches that most insurance companies prefer. Now, when I say evidence-based, what I mean is that there have been scientific studies on that particular approach, and those studies have found the approach to be effective for treating a specific condition. When it comes to individual mental health disorders, some of the most common evidence-based approaches are cognitive behavioral therapy, dialectical behavioral therapy, acceptance and commitment therapy, and exposure therapy. For couples, the most widely used evidence-based approaches are the Gottman method and emotionally focused therapy. Now, that's by no means a comprehensive list of evidence-based treatment approaches, but those are some approaches that are really common. So the question that comes up when people are seeking therapy is, which approach is going to be best for me? So again, that answer is, it depends. There are definitely some approaches that are considered the gold standard for treatment of a particular disorder. Exposure therapy for OCD, for example, or dialectical behavioral therapy for borderline personality disorder. But there are exceptions to every rule. So if you are interested, you can Google some of these approaches, find out what they're about, and see if one of them really speaks to you. But my advice to people looking for a therapist is usually not to worry so much about the treatment approach. Like I said, most therapists have been trained in many different approaches, and your therapist should be able to listen to you if you say that the approach they're using isn't working for you. That's a conversation the two of you should be able to have. The main thing you should be thinking about is, how do I feel interacting with this therapist? Does this therapist seem to listen deeply? Does this therapist seem to really get what's going on with me? And can they explain to me why they're doing what they're doing in a way that resonates with me? Because here's the thing, your therapist can pivot and change their approach, but they can't change who they are. So find the therapist you actually want to spend time with, one who you really connect with, and that's the therapist that's going to be right for you. Most of the time, therapy should feel good. It's not a friendship, but your therapist should be someone that you look forward to spending time with, whose compassion and support you can feel. Finally, let's talk about some questions you can ask a potential therapist at the outset to see if they're right for you. Before you ever make contact, check out the therapist's website or directory profile and see what they say about themselves and their work. If you like what you're seeing, check and see if they offer a free consultation. Almost all therapists offer at least a free 15-minute phone consultation because they also want to make sure that they're a good fit for the client before scheduling an initial meeting. Next, if you need to use health insurance, you should ask if they accept your plan. Be ready to have the name of the exact plan you're on with your insurance company. If you just say, I have Blue Cross and Blue Shield, the therapist won't know if that's Federal Blue Cross, Anthem Blue Cross, Blue Options, PPO, or whatever. Just look at your insurance card before you talk to the therapist and find out the complete insurance plan name and not just the name of the insurance company. Finally, after you've told the therapist what kinds of problems you're needing help with, ask the therapist to say a little bit about how they go about helping people like you. See if their answer shows that they seem to understand what sort of help you're needing and if the way they're explaining their approach to the problem makes sense to you. If the therapist's response doesn't resonate with you, or if it feels uncomfortable, or if it's hard to understand, it's definitely a good call to try contacting some other therapists. Finally, it's totally okay to have initial consultations with around 3 therapists. But once you settle on a therapist, go ahead and stick with it for a while to give it a chance unless there's some really good reason not to. It never makes sense to jump from therapist to therapist or to have more than one individual or couples therapist at a time. Okay, I hope those tips and suggestions are helpful to you in your journey into getting connected with the perfect fit therapist for you. This is a brand new YouTube channel, so please be sure to subscribe, share, like, and comment below. I'd love to hear about your journey and how therapy has helped you transform your life and your relationships.